Well, after Jesus was arrested, there were a total of 6 trials of Jesus. 3 before the Jewish authorities and 3 before the Roman authorities. John 18:12-14 says, "Then a detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it would be good if one man died for the people." John 18:12-14. Then Annas sent him, still bound, to Caiaphas, the high priest. John 18:24. So we see on our map here, after Annas had interrogated Jesus, he sent him to Caiaphas, which the traditional spot is not far from the upper room. And we see in this painting Jesus before Caiaphas, Caiaphas being the father-in-law of Annas. Now, Caiaphas was the original high priest, but deposed by the Romans. But in the Jewish minds, he would have been still the true high priest. There's a church that remembers that interrogation. It's kind of an unusual name, Church of the Cock Crowing. It sounds a little bit more sophisticated in Latin. St. Peter and Gallicantu means same thing. St. Peter and the cock crowing remembers Peter's denials of Jesus. But at the lower area of this church, when they were digging there, they found what they thought looked like a holding cell, a place to keep prisoners maybe overnight till the trial in the morning. And so this is in the basement area of that church. So possibly Jesus would have been held there. From there, the house of Caiaphas, Jesus is taken to the Sanhedrin, and we believe that those took place near the Hulda Gates at the southern end of the Temple Mount area. At daybreak, the council of the elders of the people, both the chief priests and the elders of the law, met together, and Jesus was led before them. Luke 22:66. And so there's the Hulda Gates indicated in our sketch here. And in this vicinity was found an inscription that mentioned the Zekanim, the Hebrew term for the elders. So that led to the theory that the Sanhedrin met near this area. And so very possible that Jesus would have been brought before the elders or the Sanhedrin here at this area, at the southern end of the Temple Mount. Here's the model showing the Hulda Gates. There's 2 sets of gates. The prophet Hulda was from the time of Josiah, and she was a prophetess, and so these gates were named after her. And typically, you would enter the temple area by the eastern set of gates, the ones on the right, and you would exit by the western ones, the ones on the left. And there's a monumental stairway that leads up to these gates, and where the Hulda Gates used to be. And this was a favorite teaching place for the rabbis, and it's possible that Jesus would have taught there as well. Matthew 23:27 says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of dead men's bones and everything unclean. Matthew 23:27. Well, we're on that monumental stairway in front of what used to be the Holy Gates. We're looking due east over to the Mount of Olives, where there's a cemetery today, and there was a cemetery there in the days of Jesus. And so it's very possible that while teaching, Jesus just motioned with his hand and mentioned that the Pharisees were like whitewashed tombs, which were just off to the east. So we can see the cemeteries here on the Mount of Olives. Rather large cemetery. In fact, the whole southern end of the Mount of Olives is covered with graves. And to this day, the area is just filled with graves. Mark 15:1 says, "Very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin reached a decision. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate." Mark 15:1. Okay, so the Jews originally went through their trials, and then they handed Jesus over to Pilate, the Roman authority. There's a couple of locations, or likely locations, for Pontius Pilate. One, and probably the more likely location, would have been the Fortress Antonia, just at the northwest corner of the Temple Mount area. So it's possible they went from the Holy Gates up to the Fortress Antonia. Another location, or possible location, for Pilate was Herod the Great's palace. Now, he had already passed away, but his palace was located on the western hill, which is a little bit to the south and west of the Antonia Fortress. In fact, you can make out the Antonia Fortress in the upper portion of our slide here. The top's kind of cut off, but if you look straight up and slightly to the right, that would be the Antonia Fortress. So either of these locations is possible for the location where Jesus was taken before Pontius Pilate, but the Antonia Fortress is probably the better of the two. Here we can see the Antonia Fortress location that is in proximity to the temple, just to the north of it. And that was very intentional. The Romans wanted to be able to squash any attempted rebellion in the Temple Mount area. When Jews would be gathering there for the three great feasts with a lot of religious zeal and fervor, they knew that that was the time that riots could break out. So they wanted to be able to dispatch their soldiers quickly to the Temple Mount area. So the Antonia Fortress was right up connected to the Temple Mount area. On hearing this, Pilate asked if the man was a Galilean. When he learned that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased, because for a long time he had been wanting to see him. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform some miracle. But Jesus answered Herod nothing, and so Herod sent him back to Pilate. So the location of Herod was probably at the old Hasmonean palace. The Hasmoneans were the ones who were kind of in charge from the 1st century BC into the 1st century AD. Many of the Sadducees were Hasmonean, and they had a palace there. So it's possible that Herod would have been located there in the center of our slide. A Hasmonean palace would have looked like, and a possible location for Herod Antipas. So Herod sends Jesus back to Pilate. So back he goes to the Fortress Antonia. We see that fortress here in the slide. And before Pilate Pilate tries to set him free. Even his wife warns him to have nothing to do with this man. But the crowds cry out for Jesus to be crucified. And so Pilate finally caves into the pressure and pronounces sentence upon Jesus at a place called the Pavement that we'll see just in a moment. But he has Jesus scourged, and the devices used for scourging are called flagrums. And these whips were especially brutal. One type had pieces of sharp bone in the strands of the whip, which when they would land on the flesh of the person's back and the torturer would retrieve the whip, it would tear off flesh from the back of the person that was accused. So extremely painful, just lacerating the flesh of the person being tortured. And oftentimes the victim would not even survive the scourging. Another type of flagrum had lead balls at the end. So these heavy lead balls would literally beat the person as he was being whipped. So very, very brutal way to torture a victim, somebody that was accused. John 19:6-7 says, "As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, 'Crucify, crucify!' But Pilate answered, 'You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him.' The Jews insisted, 'We have a law, and according to that law he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God.'" John 19:6-7. When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. John 19:13-14. In that place of judgment, Gabbatha, in Latin, it's the lithostrotos, the pavement. This particular slab of pavement that you see here was originally thought to date to the time of Jesus, but scholars now say it's to a slightly later period, to the time of Hadrian. This is found near the Sisters of Zion convent. And in that same pavement, there's a Roman game inscribed in the pavement there. Kind of reminds us of how the soldiers gambled for Jesus' clothes because they didn't want to tear his clothing. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. John 19:15-16. So Pilate acquiesces. He literally washes his hands. And that expression, that idiom, has come down in English to this day. To wash one's hands of something is to say, "I am not guilty of this. I had nothing to do with this. This is not my fault." And this is what Pilate was saying. So that expression, to wash one's hands of something, means I have no responsibility for it. And in Jerusalem, there's a small chapel that has a stained glass of Pilate washing his hands. And it reminds us of this biblical event where he declared that he was not taking responsibility for putting to death Jesus.